They say that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who listens without speaking, but I would argue that the most dangerous person is the one you think you know, yet do not know at all. My husband, Richard, believed that he was the sun around which my small, quiet world revolved, and for 30 years, I let him believe it because it kept the peace in a house that was often too cold for comfort. He prided himself on his intellect, his travels, and his ability to speak languages that he thought were far beyond my comprehension. Never once suspecting that the woman pouring his tea had a past he had never bothered to ask about. Before I go any further, let me say something honest. If this opening hit you in any way, subscribe to Voices of Emily so you stay here with me for the rest of this story. I am putting a part of myself into these words, and I want you to walk through it with me. And when you can, leave a comment telling me what this moment reminded you of. Your voice matters here. Then tap the like button so this story reaches someone who might need it more than we know. You must understand that silence in a marriage is not always empty. Sometimes it is full of things that we are too afraid to say, or perhaps, things we are waiting for the right moment to reveal. For decades, I played the role of the dutiful, simple wife who nodded at the right times and smiled when guests were present, allowing Richard to shine as the brilliant businessman he believed himself to be. He would often explain things to me that I already understood, simplifying his words as if he were speaking to a child, and I would simply smooth the tablecloth and let him feel superior. It did not hurt me to let him have his vanity, or so I told myself, because I knew who I was even if he did not care to look deep enough to see it. But there is a limit to how much a soul can endure before the quiet becomes a heavy stone in your chest. The cracks in our foundation had been growing for years, hidden under layers of polite conversation, and the routine of a life that looked perfect from the outside. Richard had become increasingly dismissive, his eyes wandering to his phone more often than they ever met mine, and his tone growing sharper with every passing month. He had started traveling to Tokyo frequently for business, or so he claimed, coming back with expensive gifts that felt less like tokens of love, and more like payments for my continued ignorance. I remember the day he announced that he was bringing a very important potential partner, Mr. Tanaka, to our home for a private dinner that could define the future of his company. Richard was frantic, pacing the living room floor, and dictating the menu to me with the precision of a general commanding a weary soldier. He emphasized that Mr. Tanaka was a traditional man who appreciated old-fashioned hospitality, and he warned me, with a finger pointed at my face, not to embarrass him. Just serve the food and keep the conversation to a minimum, Elizabeth, he told me. Mr. Tanaka speaks very little English, and I will be conducting the business in Japanese, so you would only be in the way. I nodded, as I always did, and promised him that everything would be perfect, suppressing the urge to tell him that his pronunciation of Japanese vowels was atrocious. You see, Richard did not know that long before I met him, in a life that felt like it belonged to another woman. I had spent 5 years living in Kyoto. I had gone there as a young student, hungry for the world, and I had stayed to teach English, immersing myself so deeply in the culture and the language that I still dreamt in Japanese sometimes. When I met Richard years later in New York, I was already the quiet version of myself, recovering from a heartbreak I never discussed. And since he never asked about my skills, I never offered them. The day of the dinner arrived with a sky the color of bruised plums, threatening a storm that seemed to match the tension vibrating within the walls of our home. I spent the entire afternoon preparing the meal, ensuring that the dashi was perfectly clear, and that the sashimi was sliced with the precision of a surgeon. I wanted the evening to go smoothly, not for Richard's sake, but because I took pride in my home and I refused to give him any reason to look down on me. As I arranged the flowers in the entryway, choosing lilies for their subtle scent, I heard Richard on the phone in his study, his voice low and hurried. He was speaking in English, but the tone was one of conspiracy, the kind of hushed urgency a man uses when he is hiding something he knows will destroy him if it comes to light. She will not understand a thing, do not worry, he said, followed by a laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping against concrete. Once the contract is signed tonight, I will have the liquidity to finalize the arrangements we discussed, and then I will be free. I froze, my hand hovering over a white lily, a cold dread settling in my stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It is a terrible thing to realize that the person you have shared your life with views you as an obstacle to be removed rather than a partner to be cherished. I walked into the kitchen, my heart pounding a rhythm against my ribs that felt like a warning drum, and I forced myself to breathe slowly. I did not know exactly what he meant, but I knew enough to understand that tonight was not just a business meeting. It was the beginning of my end, or so he planned. I decided then and there that I would not be the victim he expected me to be. I would be the observer, the witness, and if necessary, the judge. Mr. Tanaka arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, a man of quiet dignity with silver hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Richard greeted him with a deep bow that was slightly too theatrical, his Japanese greeting clumsy and accented, but Mr. Tanaka smiled politely and returned the gesture. I stood a few steps behind Richard, my hands clasped in front of me, wearing a simple navy dress that Richard had selected because he said it made me look respectable and unobtrusive. Richard introduced me in English. "This is my wife Elizabeth," and then he turned to Mr. Tanaka and added in Japanese, "She is just the housekeeper effectively." My blood ran cold, turning to ice in my veins, but my face remained a mask of polite hospitality, a skill I had perfected over 30 years of marriage. Mr. Tanaka looked at me with a flicker of confusion, perhaps wondering why a man would speak of his wife with such disdain, but he bowed to me nonetheless. I returned the bow, going deeper than a Westerner typically would, a subtle signal that went unnoticed by my husband, but caused Mr. Tanaka's eyebrows to lift slightly. We moved to the dining room, where the table was set with the finest china and crystal, the candlelight flickering on the faces of the two men who held my future in their hands. As I served the first course, a delicate clear soup, Richard began his pitch, switching between English for my benefit when discussing innocuous topics and Japanese for the serious business. He spoke of market shares and expansion, his confidence swelling with every sentence, fueled by the wine he was drinking too quickly. Mr. Tanaka listened intently, nodding occasionally, his gaze drifting to me every time I entered the room to refill a glass or clear a plate. I moved like a ghost, silent and efficient, catching snippets of Richard's Japanese that made my stomach churn with a mixture of anger and nausea. "The company is entirely in my name," Richard said in Japanese, gesturing expansively with his wine glass, completely unaware that I understood every syllable. "My wife has no head for business. She thinks of nothing but her garden and her charity lunches." He laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves, and continued, "She has no idea that this deal will allow me to restructure the assets." It was a bold-faced lie. I had managed our household finances for decades, and had been the one to encourage him to invest in his first venture. Let me pause for just a second. This part of the story is where things start to get heavier, and I want you to stay with me for it. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. It keeps you close while I take you through the rest of this. And if something in this stirred a memory in you, tell me in the comments. After that, press like so this story does not disappear into the feed. I went back to the kitchen and gripped the edge of the granite countertop, staring at my reflection in the darkened window, seeing a woman I barely recognized. How had I allowed myself to become this small, this invisible, to a man who saw me as nothing more than furniture in his life? I thought of the years I had supported him, the nights I had stayed up helping him format his presentations, the sacrifices I had made so he could chase his dreams. And here he was, selling me out to a stranger in a language he thought was his secret code, mocking the very loyalty that had kept him afloat. I took a deep breath, composing myself, and carried out the main course, placing the platter of roasted fish in the center of the table with steady hands. Richard was now leaning in closer to Mr. Tanaka, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that he assumed was safe from my ears. "To be honest, Tanaka-san," he said in Japanese, "I am planning to leave her once this deal is finalized next month." I paused, my hand tightening on the back of my own chair, while Richard continued, oblivious to the storm gathering behind him. "I have met someone else, someone younger, more vibrant," Richard boasted, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who believes he has already won the game. "Elizabeth is old. She has lost her spark and she is a bore to be around." Mr. Tanaka looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and glancing at me with pity, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else but at this table. "But I need the capital from your investment to pay her the settlement I have designed," Richard added. "It is a small amount, but she is simple. She will not know the difference." The cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me for a moment, but then something shifted deep inside my soul. The sadness that had been weighing me down evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that felt like armor plating encasing my heart. He was not just planning to leave me. He was planning to cheat me, to leave me with nothing after I had given him the best years of my life. I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and I saw him for what he was. A small, insecure man who needed to diminish others to feel big. I sat down at my place at the end of the table, picking up my napkin and placing it on my lap with deliberate, graceful movements. Richard glared at me, annoyed that I was not retreating to the kitchen as he had likely hoped, but he could not make a scene in front of his guest. "Is everything all right, dear?" he asked in English, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You look a bit tired. Perhaps you should rest." I smiled at him, a smile that did not reach my eyes, and said, "I am perfectly fine, Richard. Please continue." He turned back to Mr. Tanaka, switching to Japanese instantly. "See? She has no idea what is happening. It is almost pathetic." Mr. Tanaka did not smile this time. He looked down at his plate, his honor clearly offended by Richard's lack of discretion and respect. "In Japan, we value loyalty above all," Mr. Tanaka said softly in Japanese, a warning that Richard was too arrogant to hear. Of course," Richard replied, waving his hand dismissively. "But business is business, and a man has needs." I reached for the teapot, pouring a fresh cup for Mr. Tanaka, my hand steady, my movements fluid and practiced, reminiscent of the tea ceremonies I had studied decades ago. As I placed the cup down, I looked Mr. Tanaka directly in the eyes, holding his gaze with an intensity that made him pause. Richard was busy pouring himself more wine, celebrating a victory that had not yet happened, completely ignoring the shift in the atmosphere. It was time. The silence had served its purpose, and now it was time for the truth to speak, and it would speak in the language of my youth. "Tanaka-san," I said, my voice clear and melodic, speaking in flawless, formal Japanese. "The tea is from the Shizuoka Prefecture, specifically chosen to cleanse the palate." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room, leaving only the sound of Richard's wine glass hitting the table. Mr. Tanaka's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly in shock, while Richard froze, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure. I did not look at my husband. I kept my eyes locked on Mr. Tanaka, offering him a small, respectful bow from my seated position. Profound apologies for my husband's rudeness. I continued in Japanese, using the humble forms of speech that indicated high breeding and education. "He labors under the delusion that I am deaf and blind, but as you can see, I am neither." Richard was making a choking sound, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Elizabeth," he whispered in English, his voice trembling. What are you doing?" I ignored him completely, as if he were the ghost now, and continued to address our guest. My husband believes that he is the architect of his own success, I told Mr. Tanaka, but he forgets that it was my inheritance that funded the startup of this company 30 years ago. Mr. Tanaka turned his gaze to Richard, his expression hardening into one of cold judgment. He also seems to have forgotten, I added, my voice hardening slightly, that the house we are sitting in, and the assets he plans to hide, are legally in both of our names. Richard scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over with a loud crash. Stop it! Stop talking! Richard shouted in English, panic rising in his voice, his carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. You don't know what you're saying. I slowly turned my head to look at him, my expression placid, almost bored. Oh, I believe I do, Richard. I replied in English, then switched back to Japanese for Mr. Tanaka. He plans to divorce me for a younger woman and leave me destitute. He has insulted my intelligence and my honor in your presence, assuming you would be complicit in his deceit. Mr. Tanaka stood up slowly, placing his napkin on the table with a finality that sounded like a judge's gavel. In business, he said in Japanese, his voice stern and deep, one cannot trust a man who betrays his own family. He looked at Richard with utter contempt. If you will lie to the woman who shares your life, you will certainly lie to your partners. There will be no deal, Mr. Thompson. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Richard looked from me to Mr. Tanaka, his eyes wild with desperation. Wait. You don't understand, Richard pleaded, reaching out a hand as if to grab Mr. Tanaka, who stepped back with a look of distaste. She tricked me. She never told me she spoke Japanese. Mr. Tanaka shook his head slowly. She did not trick you, he said in English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. You simply never asked. That is your failure, not hers. He bowed to me, a deep, respectful bow that acknowledged me as his equal. Madam, your Japanese is exquisite. I apologize that you had to endure such disrespect in your own home. I stood and returned the bow. Thank you, Tanaka-san. I appreciate your integrity. With that, Mr. Tanaka turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving Richard standing amidst the ruins of his ambition. The front door closed with a click that echoed through the silent house. Richard turned to me, his face a mask of red fury and fear. You ruined everything, he screamed. Do you have any idea what you just did? That deal was worth millions. I saved myself, I said calmly, picking up the dirty plates. And as for the millions, you were never going to share them with me anyway, were you? He sputtered, trying to find a lie that would work. But he knew it was too late. I want a divorce, I said, my voice steady. And unlike you, I will not be hiding anything. I will take exactly what is mine, which, considering I funded the company, is half of everything. He looked at me with hatred, but also with a new emotion, fear. He had realized, finally, that he was not the smartest person in the room. The days that followed were a whirlwind of lawyers and paperwork, but I moved through them with a lightness I had not felt in years. Richard tried to fight, of course, trying to hide assets and bully me into a smaller settlement, but he had underestimated me one time too many. I had kept records, copies of documents he thought were secure, and I knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. The humiliation with Mr. Tanaka had spread through his professional circle, and his reputation was in tatters. No one wanted to do business with a man who had been so publicly exposed as a fool and a traitor. I remember the day he moved out. It was raining again, just like the night of the dinner, but this time I did not feel a sense of dread. I stood on the porch, watching him load his boxes into his car, a much smaller car than the luxury sedan he used to drive. He looked older, defeated, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own arrogance. He paused before getting into the driver's seat and looked back at me. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice hoarse. Why did you let me make a fool of myself for all those years? I didn't let you do anything, Richard, I replied softly. You did it all by yourself. All you had to do was treat me like a partner, like a human being. But you were too busy listening to your own voice to hear anyone else. He stared at me for a long moment, then got in the car and drove away, disappearing into the gray curtain of rain. I went back inside, made myself a cup of tea, and sat in the silence. But this time, the silence was not heavy, it was peaceful. It was my own. I am an old woman now, and my life is very different from what it was. I travel to Japan often, visiting old friends and drinking tea in gardens that smell of moss and pine. I have not remarried, for I have found that I enjoy my own company far too much to compromise it again. But I often think of that night, and the look on Richard's face when I spoke. It taught me that our true power does not lie in how loud we shout, but in what we hold in reserve. Before I close this story, let me say this. Telling stories like this takes something out of a man. And if you found any meaning in it, subscribe to Voices of Emily so we stay connected for the next one. Then share a comment with your thoughts, or your experience. I read everyone because your perspective matters more than you think. And if this story left an imprint on you, tap the like button so it reaches someone who might be walking through their own version of it tonight.